Sergeant Jack Calloway sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the worn combat boots he'd laced up 1,000 times before. His dog tags clinked lightly as they hung from his neck, catching the dim light of the barracks. He'd been a soldier for most of his life, fighting in wars that felt both distant and personal. It had started when he was barely out of high school, enlisting in the army, full of idealism, ready to serve his country and make a difference. Now, years later, that idealism had been replaced by a cold, quiet resolve. The war he had fought in wasn't one of glory or triumph. It wasn't the kind of war that made heroes out of men. It was messy, brutal, and endless, one of those drawn-out conflicts in the Middle East that seemed to have no end, no clear purpose anymore. He'd been deployed 5 times over the years, each tour taking something from him, leaving him a little more haunted, a little less whole. His latest tour had been the worst. It was 2032, and Jack was part of an elite special forces unit stationed in a volatile region of northern Syria. The mission had been to destabilize a growing insurgency, one that had risen in the power vacuum left behind by the collapse of the local government. It was supposed to be simple: gather intel, eliminate key targets, and support local forces. But war was never simple. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Jack and his squad moved through the narrow, winding streets of a bombed-out town. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burning. Buildings that had once been homes and businesses were now crumbling shells, their windows shattered, their walls scarred by bullets and explosions. Jack led the team, his eyes scanning every shadow, every alley, every rooftop. His squad was small, just 6 men, all highly trained and seasoned by years of combat. They moved like a well-oiled machine, communicating with hand signals and quick, whispered commands. The intel they'd received suggested that an insurgent leader was hiding in the town, using the ruins as a base of operations. "Keep sharp," Jack murmured into his comms. "They know we're coming." The squad moved quietly, but tension hung in the air. They all felt it. This town had been quiet for days, too quiet. Jack had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now, his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the streets, a sniper's shot. Jack dove to the ground just as one of his men, Corporal Diaz, went down, a bullet tearing through his shoulder. "Sniper!" Someone yelled, and chaos erupted. The squad scattered, taking cover behind the broken remnants of walls and cars as more gunfire rang out. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was calm, focused. Years of combat had trained him for moments like this. "Find that sniper." Jack barked into his radio, peeking out from behind a wall to get a sense of where the shots were coming from. He spotted movement on a rooftop 3 blocks away. Top of the building, 3 o'clock. He called out. Private Matthews, the squad's designated marksman, set up his rifle behind a pile of rubble and took the shot. A moment later, the sniper's fire ceased. "Sniper down," Matthews confirmed, but the relief was short-lived. Out of the shadows of the buildings came a flood of insurgents, their faces covered, rifles blazing. Jack's squad was outnumbered, pinned down in the narrow streets with little cover. Bullets pinged off the walls around them, and the sound of explosions from RPGs echoed through the air. Jack's mind raced. They had walked into a trap. "Fall back," Jack ordered, knowing they couldn't hold their position. "We need to get out of here." The squad began to retreat, moving from cover to cover, but the insurgents were relentless, pushing them back with overwhelming firepower. Jack felt the sharp sting of shrapnel as a grenade exploded nearby, but he kept moving, his training overriding the pain. "Come on, move, move," Jack shouted, pulling Matthews to his feet after he tripped over debris. They fought their way back through the maze of the town, but the enemy was closing in fast. Jack's radio crackled with static as he called for air support, but the response was grim. They were too deep behind enemy lines, and air support wouldn't arrive in time. It was up to them now. Hours later, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the town was bathed in the cold blue light of twilight. Jack and the remaining members of his squad had managed to escape the worst of the firefight, but they were battered, bloodied, and low on ammo. Diaz was unconscious, his wound bandaged but still bleeding. They had holed up in an abandoned building, listening to the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions. Jack leaned against a cracked wall, wiping sweat and dirt from his face. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline faded, replaced by the exhaustion that came after every firefight. He looked at his men, his brothers in arms, each one of them worn down, but alive. "For now. We need to get Diaz out of here," Sergeant Williams said, his voice hoarse. "He won't make it if we don't get him to a medic soon." "I know," Jack replied, his mind working through their options. They were too far from the extraction point to make it on foot, especially with Diaz in his condition. They needed a vehicle, or some way to radio for help. But every moment they stayed here, the insurgents were closing in. "Got anything on the radio?" Jack asked Matthews, who was fiddling with the squad's communication device. Matthews shook his head. "Static. They're jamming us." Jack cursed under his breath. The situation was growing more desperate by the minute. Suddenly, the sound of engines rumbled in the distance. Jack's heart skipped a beat, either it was reinforcements, or the insurgents had found them. He peeked out of a shattered window and saw a convoy of trucks approaching from the east. They were heavily armed. "We've got company," Jack muttered, gripping his rifle. "Get ready." The trucks rolled to a stop just outside the building, and men jumped out, their weapons trained on the windows. Jack's squad readied themselves, knowing this could be their last stand. But before the firefight could begin, a voice called out from the lead truck, speaking in broken English. "Americans! We're not here to fight." Jack hesitated, motioning for his men to hold fire. A figure stepped forward from the convoy, a tall man dressed in a mix of military fatigues and civilian clothes. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "We're local resistance," the man said. "We've been fighting the same enemy you have. We can help." Jack didn't lower his weapon, but he studied the man's face, searching for any signs of deception. There was none. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice cold. "To survive," the man replied simply. "Same as you." That night, Jack's squad joined forces with the local resistance fighters. Together, they made their way through enemy territory, using the knowledge of the resistance to avoid patrols and ambushes. The resistance had been fighting this insurgency for years, knowing every inch of the land, every hidden path. After 2 grueling days of travel, they reached a friendly outpost where Jack and his men were finally able to get the medical attention they needed. Diaz survived, though he would never fight again. As Jack sat by the campfire that night, staring into the flickering flames, he thought about the war, the endless cycle of violence, the comrades he had lost, and the uncertainty of what they were really fighting for anymore. He had given so much of himself to this conflict, and for what? A few more inches of desert? Another insurgent leader taken out, only for a dozen more to take his place? But as he looked around at the men sitting beside him, his squad, the resistance fighters, all of them survivors of something far bigger than themselves, he realized that in the end, it wasn't about the politics or the strategies or the borders. It was about the people you fought for and the people you fought beside. It was about keeping them alive, one day at a time. Jack didn't know when, or if, this war would ever end. But for now, he would keep fighting. Not for a cause, not for a flag, but for his brothers in arms, and for the hope that one day, they would all find their way back home.